they were gonna head back to the MSC eventually, and then we went to breakfast. And then we went to Readerina, and then we went to another weird
Went
spot.
all the way around.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
All the way around. I was like, man, I could have faster if I walked. Because at least I knew where I was. And when I got off the bus, I had no idea what was going on.
That's funny. You know what? I messed up the other day. There were like 3 people on the bus, and I don't know. Every time I'm on the bus, I don't have to indicate where to stop. You know, they just stop at my stop. And I forgot to do it, so I had to go all the way out all by myself. The other 2 people left. I was like, I could have just got out at the first stop. Walk the other way.
Yeah. It's too late now. It's too late now.
Gives you something to do.
Yeah.
No.
I just sat there on my phone.
Gives you an excuse not to do anything.
There.
Alrighty, howdy.
Howdy.
So how y'all doing?
Good.
My legs hurt.
Yeah, I was hearing the tail end of the story. That's I have a large number of those stories.
I got off the bus with 5 minutes to go. So I
This is part of how I learned, or rather trained myself. Like, cause right like at the beginning of, I think it was last semester, because everyone had been gone because obviously, like, you know, the pandemic. And so whenever you remember exactly how many students there are on this campus, they're all back.
Yeah.
And everything is all of a sudden incredibly crowded. And so a lot of times, I mean, I live walking distance from campus, but there are points where it's like, I think I'll walk, because there have been times when I've outwalked the bus.
Yeah.
And it's like, since I'm not invisible, I wonder what it must look like to see this tiny man like scuttling across like at like 25 miles an hour on foot, sort of like, where's he going? I've always been told I look like I walk with great direction and purpose. There never is any. I just walk quickly.
Yeah, that's what my mom always drilled in my head, walk with purpose.
Marker. Here it is. So, what did we think of this section? Section 8, the private realm property.
I
As
think
full
we
dis-
didn't have to do the quiz.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I did post the quiz. I give you guys till tomorrow. Probably after today, you'll be able to answer all of it. So it all works out. But yeah, did anyone find this? I mean, the confession on my part, even I didn't get this section as much the first time reading it, right? So did anyone was just like, I still see words, like meanings are not forthcoming. Is anyone like that?
Isn't this philosophy though? Isn't that like its objective?
I mean, the objective isn't confusion. The objective is getting out of confusion, but right. So let's walk it through. I'm probably going to read a lot of it to you and we'll talk through it, but hopefully it'll make more sense, right? So what we've been doing up to this point, as we know from this chapter and all its very informative headings, is that we're talking about the private and the public, right? What the differences are, where they came from in our experience as people, and how we messed it up. Because for Arendt, we always messed it up, right? It's almost like categorically like, yeah, this is a thing, this makes some kind of sense. And of course, we messed up, we confused things, we got confused with our words. It's always about our words, right? So we talked about the public last time, right? So let's just start, right? It is with respect to this multiple significance of the public realm that the term private in its original privative sense has meaning. So what is the multiple sense? What's the multiple significance of the public?
The world itself and the appearance.
Yeah. So we have the whole fact that we were visual or perceptual creatures to whom appearances really do matter for important reasons. And then we've got the world. And what is the world made of?
The artifice, right?
Yeah, so it's things. Is it just things?
No, it's the things and the ways that we're connected to everybody. So
Okay, there's things, and what do the things connect us to?
each other.
Yeah, so things and people are always what the world means for her. Because at some point, she might have said this earlier, but probably in a footnote or an aside, our things constitute the world. We've hammered this home, the world is made of stuff. But unless, it's not just the fact that it's stuff, although that's important. We have to come back to like the objects of the stuff for her. But it's the fact that people are using the things. right? So because we talked about the fact that if something serves our needs, then it's what? Yeah, it's necessary. If something serves our wants, what is it? It's useful, right? So it's useful. Things can be either useful or necessary, at least on this side of action in the public. And if something serves our needs, our necessities, then we say that it provides us with the means of consumption, right? If something is useful to us for our purposes, and then it provides us with the means of use. And consumptible, things that we consume are consumptibles. And things that are for our use are use objects. And we're not focused on the consumptibles with regard to the world because that is where our whole metabolic cycle comes in. And the consumptibles are the things we crap out, right? We talked about everything we crap out. And the use objects is what the worlds are made out of, is what the world is made of. But it's important that we use them because that's where, in using common objects, they connect us, right? The table doesn't connect us if nobody sits at it, right? The house doesn't connect us if nobody lives in it, right? So that's important. Things need to, those distinct, that distinction is important. So the world is made of people and things, the people who use the things. So that's the multiple significance. Multiple significance just means having more than one meaning. And at the beginning of the last section, she was like, I'm going to talk to you about two meanings, right? So she's very good at keeping her promises, right? All right. To live, and now if we're wondering what that original privative sense is, right? To live an entirely private life means, above all, to be deprived of things essential to a truly human life. To be deprived of the reality, so and the quote tells you, here are the things essential for human life that you miss out on if you only live an entirely private life. To be deprived, one, of the reality that comes from being seen and heard by others. So that's, you get rid of it. If you're just private, you don't have appearance, right? You don't have that element of the world or the public. Two, to be deprived of an objective relationship with them that comes from being related to and separated from them through the intermediary of a common world of things. To be deprived, and all of that leads to be deprived of the possibility of achieving something more permanent than life itself, our quest for immortality, right? The privation of privacy, privation is the word for being deprived of something, right? The privation of privacy lies in the absence of others. As far as they are concerned, private man does not appear, and therefore it is as though he did not exist. Whatever he does remains without significance and consequence to others, and what matters to him is without interest for the people. So that's the problem of being entirely private. Under modern circumstances, this deprivation of, quote, objective relationships to others and of a reality guaranteed through them has become the mass phenomenon of loneliness, where it has assumed its most extreme and most anti-human form. So what's loneliness?
Not having other people.
That's maybe one. What else is loneliness? Presumably, we all know, and maybe not all of us, but presumably we're aware that it's possible to be lonely in a crowd of people, right? Isn't that almost paradigmatically where you're most poignantly, like the most lonely, like in a crowd of people? Where else do you feel lonely, but with a bunch of people walking around who don't care about you, right? So that's one, but is that the only thing, being deprived of others?
A reality guaranteed through them.
Yeah, so why do we need others?
They constitute our reality. They're the ones who we check with. And people are like, I see you, your reality.
Yeah, although she doesn't use this word, it might be a nice word to have. What other people and things, but especially other people, function as for us, as what we can call touchstones, right? Whenever you're like, a touchstone, of course, isn't just a stone that you touch, but like its functions as like a place to get your bearings, right? You think you're going crazy because your boyfriend was gaslighting you. So you talk to your friends and they all tell you and assure you that actually he is just an ass, right? And then you feel better, right? And that's very important because the alternative is that perhaps you could go crazy. You could lose all sense of self from being gaslit by your boyfriend. So don't let your boyfriend or your girlfriend gaslight you, right? So that's what things function as, and that's why we need to have them. They function as touchstones for us. Right, so where does loneliness come from then?
Being exclusively private.
Let's keep digging. Where does the loneliness come from? Yeah, not literally. I mean, again, it's always kind of anticlimactic because we're building, and it's just like, yeah, not being connected to others. What would we need to be connected to others? Well, we need to see them first of all. We Zooming from your room or Skyping just is not going to work usually, right? So of course we need a place to appear. You've got to have somewhere to go, right? I'm not sure if Arendt would particularly like this example, but that is, after all, where we get the word for pub, right? A pub is a public house. What do you do at the public house? You go to hang out with the people. You drink beers and eat Scotch eggs, or whatever those are. So we would need other people, a place to appear with others, and of course, place to appear with others, like the stuff that's going to have us in common. So another thing, though, of course, it is important that we have things in common, but there's more than one way to have things in common. And again, one way to create things in common is to talk about them, right? So simple recipes for addressing the loneliness issue, which is still a very big issue. We need to talk to people more, and in a place and in a way that we can actually connect to them, right? The reason for this extremity is that mass society not only destroys the public realm, but the private as well. Deprives men not only of their place in the world, but of their private home, where they once felt sheltered against the world, and where at any rate, even those excluded from the world could find a substitute in the warmth of the hearth and the limited reality of family life. Yeah, so we've been seeing, as we've said numerous times before, a bunch of these kind of binaries or dichotomies of things that seem like they're opposed to each other, right? The one we're doing right now is private versus public, right? What are other ones we've done?
Necessity.
Versus, well, we've talked about needs and wants, but in these terms,
Oh,
what's the
necessity and
opposite?
freedom. Freedom.
Yeah.
That was the one.
Necessity and freedom. And let's see.
Perception and reality.
Yeah, appearance and reality, right?
The private and social kind of.
Yeah, so it's like the intimate, right? And the social. So it may seem when you're reading, especially because of the way she writes, that what she's really doing is ragging on one of them, right? It might sound as though she's talking about, it was really great when we used to have freedom and now we're too busy addressing our needs. Isn't it horrible to like be bound by necessity? At least that is one impression you can get reading the book, right? Sort of like, and again, one of the impressions you may also get, which is not entirely true, or not even really true, is that what she wants is for us to just go back being like the Greeks. That's not what the point of this is. First of all, because we can't, even if we really wanted to, and being in a fraternity or sorority doesn't really count as Greek life, right? I always thought that was really funny, calling it Greek life. I'm like, so they're philosophers? Never, right? But so for all of these, it may seem as though we really only want or need one of them, right? And one of those classic examples is that with appearance and reality, especially philosophers after Plato thought that appearance and reality are different, but they're not just different, they're opposite. So appearances are always deceiving, and we really want to get down to reality, right? But the truth is that what Arendt's pointing out in that passage right there is that actually usually both poles of a dichotomy or a binary are actually important. And if you lose, because it's important because we make sense of them through each other. There's really no way of defining freedom without reference to necessity, because freedom is always freedom from some kind of necessity. But at the same time, necessity only makes sense to us because we have some experience of at various points not needing things, right? If you were always starving, I mean, that really wouldn't be a way to live, but it's not even clear that physiologically we're capable of that. You know what it's like to be hungry because you know what it's like to be full, right? If you were never full, then your hunger would just be how you live, right? So it's tempting to want to only think about one, but one of the points which Arendt is getting at is that if we try to do that, then actually we could destroy both of them. So if you entirely get rid of the public, you're not going to just have the side effect of getting rid of the public, you're going to actually also bring about the destruction of the private. See, because the public only makes sense if there's a front door to exit through to get there. And if there's no front door, if everything is public, then nothing is private, and vice versa, right? So it's important that we use these to make sense of each other. So if you destroy one, you destroy the other. What we want is to understand the difference between the two, not because we want to get rid of any of them, but because we're trying to understand them, right? So with the rise of society and the consumption of the public by the private, that will eventually result in the destruction of our private, and that we will experience that very likely as loneliness, right? And amongst other things, loneliness is just one of the many symptoms of the problems in society, right? The full development of the life of hearth and family into inner and private space we owe to the extraordinary political sense of the Roman people, who, unlike the Greeks, never sacrificed the private to the public, but on the contrary understood that these two realms could exist only in the form of coexistence, right? Like we just said. And although the conditions of slaves probably were hard, let's skip that, it's not just relevant. Right, so on page 60, another thing that she does, she talks about is that in explaining where we went wrong or where our misunderstandings came from, she's always going to use usually an example from the past, an example from the present. The example from the past is, of course, the history of early Christianity. It's like, it makes sense that Christians from a very early date would have struggled with this private public thing for very specific reasons, right? And it's not knocking Christianity, it's just saying that's part of why this all came about, right, in our understanding. And the modern equivalent, not of Christianity, but of other people who missed that particular point, would be Marxists, right? Because the idea is, even though that both Christians and Marxists agreed in a certain sense that the public or state craft, so to speak, the polis was kind of like a necessary evil, and both imagine a state of things where it eventually doesn't have to exist anymore. The whole point is that if we get rid of the public and it no longer exists anymore, you're not even going to have the social or the private, which is what you wanted, right? So that's what all that's about. As she cites the whole sort of long tradition of Christian morality, which, contrary to what we might think living in the Bible Belt, really did once maintain like mind your own business, right? Like just mind your own business. And why? Because if you conceive of yourself in a worldless way, if you think of yourself, right? Not necessarily only if you're Christian, but with a lot of traditions, if you think of yourself as only a passer through, then this whole public administration thing doesn't seem that important, right? If you're just passing through, if the world could end at any moment, it's not your problem, right? So that sensibility grows out of that. Right, okay, so 61. The profound connection between private and public, manifest on its most elementary level in the question of private property, is likely to be misunderstood today. Why? Why are we likely to misunderstand the profound connection between private and public, manifest in public property? In private property.
Because of the social, right? Because of it's getting blurred. We're letting it more and more into our private lives.
Well, I mean, that's definitely true. Like, it's part of what she's saying, but for our specific problem with understanding private property, why are we likely to not get what private property is?
It says because of wealth on one side and poverty on the other.
Yeah, right, like, Maddie, right?
Yes.
It's, we are likely to be not really get the point of property because we equate property with wealth. And so it's going to be really important that wealth and property aren't the same thing. And similarly, not having propertylessness is not going to be the same thing as poverty. And that's also one of the points she brings up a little bit earlier, where it's like, we often assume that slaves were poor, right? They didn't have to be, right? Being a slave didn't mean, well, yeah, it didn't mean just being poor. We're likely to assume that someone would only have been a slave if they were, but that's not really how that worked. The majority of slaves, at least for the Greeks, to a certain extent for the Romans, came about through conquest, right? It wasn't like in the case of American slavery, a racial or generational thing. But anyway, for these reasons, we are likely to misunderstand the difference or the importance of private property because we just think of it in terms of wealth. But if it's not wealth, what is it? What does Arendt bring to our attention that property really is?
Says it's more important than wealth.
Definitely, it's more important, but we need to know what it is so we can know why. Why is property important for politics for the public that we've been talking about?
Because to have property means that you could leave it.
Okay, so you need property to leave it. What's all this stuff about walls? And doesn't she talk a lot about like walls and boundaries or something? What's that all about?
Yeah, it says originally property on page 61. It says originally property meant no more or less than to have one's location in a particular part of the world, and therefore it belonged to the body politic.
Yeah. So what does property really refer to?
Physical dwelling.
It's a place, right? It's a spot. It's your spot in the world, right? As we might have mentioned, so in Greek, like we mentioned, our word idiot comes from effectively the word for privacy, but really the idea of idion is one's own, right? So I mean, it doesn't literally mean privacy, although that in the second has the sense of it. Like idion or idia is belonging to one, right? Yours, right? The Latin equivalent is propertas, I think. But it's the same root, right? So property also comes down to meaning one's own. And in this case, it's one's own place, right? So that's what property is. How does it become politically significant? I realize I ask a lot of like abstract questions that are not very easy to latch onto. I'll try to reformulate it at some point, or if at any point the questions don't make sense, just let me know. But how do we go from having a place of your own to all of a sudden being part of, and of course it is going to be related to the fact that we leave it like we've been saying. But in terms of the organization of the city state, how did property, why was it, it's going to have to do with the walls and the boundaries sort of thing, but sort of where does property fit in the polis?
Go for it.
The head of the household kind of, it says they constitute the public realm. So that makes me think that a bunch of heads of their household would be basically running the public.
Okay, that's a really good point, right? We want to probably iron out one important thing, which might, I don't know if any of you had this, if there's a risk of misunderstanding here, right? It seems like she's been telling us this whole time that household life is where we got the idea of privacy, and that the private is not the public, household life is not part of the public. And yet here she's saying that the heads of that the families constitute the public. So what's that about? Did anyone notice that weirdness and be like, wait a minute, you've been telling us this whole time, how do families fit into the polis, right? They fit, I think, something a little like this. Because it's the reason why it's important to bring it back to place and to talk about that as well is because, again, of our assumptions about what family really is, right? Now, when we think of family, particularly like nuclear families and those sorts of things, we think about a family primarily in terms of blood relations, right? Or like kin relations. The fact that all things being equal, you probably at one point came out of your mother, right? And that we can, and by these means, we have infallible routes of tracing who's related to who, right? But that stuff, as far as our biology is concerned, isn't the sort of political significance of the household or the family, because they do have political significance. This is kind of the significance which they have. And this is why she talks about walls and boundaries so much, is that everyone needs a place of their own. Naturally, because, well, we're the kinds of creatures we are, but it's as though everybody needs a space of their own. But from the Greek perspective and Roman perspective, the boundaries are sacred, right? So imagine this is your house or property or whatever. This would have been well, actually, so let's do it this way, right? This is the city. And the city is where the public is and what politics is about, right? At the same time, the city has walls, right? And the walls is where we originally, the Greeks anyway, got the idea of law. Because laws were originally conceived of like boundaries, right? They weren't, we nowadays think of politics as lawmaking, like the business of making laws, and we vote for people who are going to go to Congress and legislate. Our idea that politics is primarily about legislation is a more Roman thing, and it comes out a bit later. But for the Greeks, the laws weren't the content of politics. They weren't what politics was about. They make it possible, but they're not actually what politics is about. And the way we can know that, the way we relate that is because, again, like the walls of a city or the walls of a house, you don't live in the walls, right? Unless you're a rat or something, but you don't live in the walls or on the walls, but the walls do create a space by acting as boundaries. So well, she brings up numerous times in what we've been reading, both in this and previous sections, is that the boundaries of the household, the place was considered sacred, right? So much so that if you were exiled or lost your citizenship or something like that, it's not just that you lose your house, although you very much do. It's even more so extreme than that. If you were exiled or something like that, they would tear your house down, right? Because it's not just a matter of getting rid of you, it's a matter of getting rid of your place, right? So, I mean, that sounds sad and tragic, right? But I mean, like, the boundaries were regarded so sacred that really family, at least in one sense, meant like, what would we call it? Not strictly the household, that's everybody. Well, yeah, the property, the land, right? The land, like the stuff on it, all of that is originally sort of what's involved in this idea of family. And of course, there's a head of family in the, like, you have the paterfamilias, right? So, but the way in which, so the walls of the city are one thing. They create these boundaries, but then there's the boundaries of the home. And inside of the home is where all the privacy happens. And out here is where the public happens. But just like you can't think one without the other, the public is constituted by all of our places in it, right? Which is also why she points out somewhere the external, like, walls of your house make up part of the city. Because even though we don't live on the walls, when you look at pictures of cities and you drive through neighborhoods, what do you see?
Walls.
You see the houses. Like, you don't see, of course, you can be nosy like me and like, I wonder what's going on inside. But really, the things we see all around us are surfaces, right? They're boundaries. They're the fact that somebody has set up a space, right? Similarly, I mean, I might have mentioned this, and this, you don't have to know this at all, but there's a similar origin for the word temple, right? A temple wasn't originally a building. It was a space, right? Specifically, it's the idea that you delimit a space, and then inside the space is where cool ritual religious stuff happens, right? But because the temples is really just the boundaries and not the thing that's going on inside, it's why you have two of them on the side of your head. So temples are limits, and just like the temples, the limits are sacred, right? Now, it's in that sense that this all kind of works. And if you notice, it looks a little bit like a cell, right? I'm a bad drawer, but you can kind of see something like a cell or a multicellular organism here, right? It's the fact that, of course, what's going on inside of each of these things is in that sense private, but they all together still make up the public because it's the common world of stuff and land and space between us, right? So the way we could visually symbolize the problem is that when each of these represents a family and a property, right? Now, if we think of all of these families as one big family, though, what happens to the boundaries between them?
They go away.
Yeah. The cell walls break down, right? And then everything is either private or public. But in the case of society, it relapses into private. Right. So that is what the criticism looks like, is to say that all of this made sense because of the boundaries. But if you break the boundaries, then the things that were made possible by those boundaries are no longer possible. Right? So that's what the whole walls thing about is for in the book. Let's see, what else? Did that make sense at all? Okay. If it, like, again, I have no idea, like, usually I'm just throwing pasta at a wall. Why was, and this, okay, so the other thing she brings up is the fact that the boundaries are in a very real way sacred, but in a certain sense, so is what happens in the private, right? It's almost like there's a certain sense of sacredness to why, maybe I should put it this way. Why does the private need to be hidden? What are we hiding?
Maybe our reality.
Oh, if we're in the private and we're not appearing, then in that sense we're hiding and not romanticizing our reality. What is the, so yeah, the walls of the house, what do they contain?
Or stuff.
They contain our stuff and our family lives, right? But what's so, I don't know, sacred or hidden about it?
Ours, we don't have to share it.
I think it's on 62, right? So the privative trait of the household. So the sense not in which you're deprived, we're not contrasting it, but saying like, oh, if you're in the private, you're not public. Like the actual content of household life, the stuff that makes it interesting to us and not just contrasted to the public. The non-privative trait of the household realm originally lay in its being the realm of birth and death, which must be hidden from the public realm because it harbors the things hidden from human eyes and impenetrable to human knowledge. It is hidden because man does not know where he comes from when he's born and where he goes when he dies. Right? So of course, most of us were probably born in hospitals, and many of us will, we don't have to talk about when and how we'll die, but all of that stuff would happen in the house at some point. So in a certain sense, it goes back to why we close the door when we go to the bathroom. Not just because we don't want to be caught in the act of going to the bathroom, but because there is something intimate about our most bodily functions, including all the stuff which goes on in the house and which we normally don't like displayed to the public, including such things as, of course, the curated Instagram photos don't count in this case, the fact that we're born, the fact that we die, the fact that we eat, the fact that we poop, the fact that we copulate. And that sums us up basically. And all of those things are the content of the private. And so, and then later on, of course, as she mentioned in the previous section, it's true that the private for us becomes the shelter for the intimate. Remember that? And then for us, the intimate will wind up including other things too, right? Like your social connections to your friends and that kind of stuff, right? So there is the stuff there in the private that's important. And it's important and hidden, not necessarily because we really just don't want it to come out in the public, but because in the same way that you're the kind of creature that has an inside and an outside, and you would be killed and or greatly harmed if somebody just opened you up and tried to turn you inside out. It's like that, right? The fact that it all comes back to families and houses is related to the fact that we have insides and outsides, and the boundaries are sacred, which is why it's such a big deal when people touch you, right? Sorry, I don't know why that was overtook me with so much energy, but not the interior of this realm, which remains hidden and of no public significance, but its exterior appearance is important for the city as well. And it appears in the realm of the city through the boundaries between one household and another. The fact that our edifices have facades, right? A facade is a front of a building, right? It is therefore not really accurate, this is 64, to say that private property prior to the modern age was thought to be a self-evident condition for admission to the public realm. It is much more than that. Privacy was like the other, the dark and hidden side of the public realm. And while to be political meant to attain the highest possibility of human existence, to have no private place of one's own, like a slave, meant to no longer be human. Right? So what we get here is, again, the real importance of having a place of one's own. It's from that, having a literal spatial location of your own, from which you can begin to build this common world thing, right? Because even though we all live our private lives as we have to and as we should, and we don't normally want to display all of that, to the world, unless for some reason you're the Kardashians, then nevertheless, the world is going to wind up, it's going to turn out that the public common world is built like modularly out of the little houses and the buildings and the stuff. And it's not that the stuff that, again, the stuff that goes on in it is private, but the fact that it's there is part of the public, right? In the same way that you could also think of it this way. In the same way that although you have things going on in your private, in your head, in your heart, wherever your mind goes when you think or daydream, you are all physically here, right? And so we're constituting this classroom, even though we all have our public and we all have our private, and we're all connected by the stuff we're all touching, right? So how does wealth come into it? Why does that become important, if it ever does? Because this is the explanation. All that we've been talking about is the explanation of why it is that the private is still important for the public, even though they're different, right? But property is not the same thing as wealth. So how does wealth enter the political scene?
Well, so where to get property?
That's a good point. I'm not sure if it's a point she makes, but that is a good point. We do have to like come by this land somehow, and it's not free.
Yeah,
So-
it says on page 65 that the property owner chose to enlarge his property instead of using it up and leading a political life. It was as though he willingly sacrificed his freedom and became voluntarily what the slave was against. Never mind, wrong passage.
No, I mean that we could go with that one really quick too, though, right? The idea is that wealth becomes important, even though it's not the point of having property. We also now, because we're all vestigial or subliminal capitalist, think of property in terms of how you can get more, right? We want to for us, we think in terms of profits. It's often confused historians and economists why, even though in the past, people like slaveholding societies had the labor power, they didn't bother engineering industry, right? On the whole part, right? The Romans did some cool stuff, but like again, it's not what you would expect from people having a whole wealth of unpaid labor at their disposal, right? But that is because of people's understanding of what labor was. It's like, yeah, you need to do it because again, we always need to meet the needs somehow, but that is not the point of having it. So it's only if, so on top of having property, what wealth is or becomes is the means of meeting your needs, right? And it's only when your property is your means of making a living that the sacredness of both of them kind of overlap, right? Because wealth wasn't sacred for the Greeks, the property was. But if you're a farmer, your property is the means by which you make your living because you have to work the land. And so that's just one example. It's not the paradigmatic example, but it's one example of how, one, your property and your wealth can become mixed up, right? Even though they're not the same thing. And the other thing is, of course, that even though property is, properly speaking, the precondition for entering the political space, because it means to have a chunk of that space and to make up that space. At the same time, if you don't have your needs met, if you're sitting in class, but your stomach is growling and you're not paying attention, then you're not able to be fully present in this public space that you actually are still part of. And so wealth still becomes requisite to being part of political life, because even though it's not the same thing as property, you do need the upkeep, right?
66 talks about wealth and the agricultural stuff.
Yeah. And so that's part of how wealth enters it. Now, I think, yeah, we still have time. Now, one of the interesting things that happened historically, whereby property began to sort of be exchanged for wealth, and this is kind of ironic, is during the Reformation, when the monasteries were liquidated, right? In case if you didn't know, right, there's the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, which is to say the 1500s, wherever it happened, particularly like in England, England's probably the best example. Because of the mass conversion of England to Protestantism, all of a sudden, all the monks and all of the Catholic monks and nuns who were living in their monasteries for all the centuries, they're just like, you have to leave, right? And so it's always like leave or convert, right? And so a lot of them went back to mainland Europe, and all the stuff of the monasteries, the gold, the jewels, the land, the cattle, the oxen, were all sort of liquidated. And now, for the first time in history, you have this weird phenomenon: a lot of liquid capital and no location, right? Let's end on that note. Not literally like, let me find it in this section. There's something. Oh, right. So on 61, in trying to get in the middle paragraph, trying to show why wealth and property are different. The present emergence everywhere or of actually or potentially very wealthy societies, which at the same time are essentially propertyless, because the wealth of any single individual consists of his share in the annual income of society as a whole, clearly shows how little these two things are connected. So how might we imagine a very wealthy but propertyless society?
Dubai. But they don't have a lot of land, but they have a lot of money with it.
Okay, so that's definitely an example. They have lots of money but very little land. They still do have land though. There's probably still some property involved there. But how could we envision like a society, like a wealthy society in which nobody really owns property? Dennis?
I mean, maybe the fact that everything's kind of limited would make it very crime ridden in terms of like stealing. Rather than having like assets that are more concrete. I don't know.
No. Yeah. It's all interesting. Let's think about it this way, right? You get your cool STEM degree. You wind up working infallibly for Google or
Yeah,
for
what about
Facebook.
digital stuff?
Oh, we might not have time for that, but we want you make a note of it. We want to come back eventually, right? You get your job, your cool tech job, with your STEM degree. You wind up landing your 6-figure salary and living in Seattle, but you rent for the rest of your life. In that sense, we are a society already in which it is possible to become financially well off without literally owning a lot of stuff. Or particularly, again, in big cities, not wanting to own a car because you will just commute, right, with public transportation or something like that, right? It's already a thing whereby the point is that as a society of job holders, which is what Arendt thinks we are, we think only in terms of the amount of money we make. Because of course, that is the lowest common denominator for meeting all our needs. If you need money, you need a job. If you need a job, you have to deal with people. Someone might fire you. So your job becomes tied up in the social as well again, right? You're not just like ranchers or like, agriculturalists or anything like that. But again, it's very possible that you could be in that position and have a lot of material wealth or affluence, and yet in the sense which was really important to the Greeks, not have a place of one's own. And in that sense, ironically, still not really be part of the public, right? So that's what that part was about. Now, another thing, since we can probably end on this note, like Eli mentioned, another confusion which she doesn't bring up at all, because again, this was written in 1950, and she is really only primarily writing about the past up to that point, not after. We also have weird things now like intellectual property, right? And what we can say about from our last section, right, is that one of the problems with that stuff, I'm not saying that she takes a stance on it or anything, is that a lot of that stuff is liable to confuse us because again, intellectual property doesn't have a tangible place in the world. And the fact that we can think of it as property and that it doesn't weird us out because we think of it just as something which I can get a financial return on, we are far more willing to peg ourselves to ideas that have no tangible place in the world.
What do you mean by does it have like a place? Because like if I get a book, because like before we talked about like if I have all these thoughts in my head but I don't convey them to anyone, they might as well not exist. But if I have a book, right, and I get it published, it exists now, someone can see it.
Yeah. No, it's true that you're absolutely right about that. I'm not sure what was the
like how can I not have a place in the world intellectual property? Because if I have like an intellectual, like if I have like Harry Potter is what's her name?
J.K. Rowling, yeah.
J.K. Rowling, that's for intellectual property. Like I can't just be like, oh,
Sure, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. That is part of the significance though of publishing them, making it public. And so it does obtain more reality the more that it's like published. I'm not saying that intellectual property isn't real or like literally isn't at some point physically located somewhere. Like presumably, this is kind of cheap, but presumably it's always located somewhere in someone's brain, right? But the point is rather that we are more comfortable in thinking in terms of property that are no longer tied paradigmatically to specific physical examples. We went from thinking about property primarily as spatial to now something that I can make money off of. That was the sort of main point. we might be out of time, but you got something?
I was just gonna say, like, intellectual property is only as good as like the language that makes it up and people that are able to like perceive and kind of understand it. So even if it does exist physically in a book, if like the actual meaning of that, the stuff in the book only exists in people's minds.
Yeah, that's another really good point. No, that is a really good point. That I think is right. All right, was that good? We'll see you guys Friday.
And the reading quizzes tomorrow night or tonight?
Tomorrow.
Or
Where do you work?
Jiffy Lube,
Okay, fine.
Jiffy Lube on 32.
Oh, okay.
If you need your oil change, come on Friday, because today we have to clean. So. Don't come because
Hi, so Carrie was wondering if we have a pack back this Friday.
You, I was gonna ask you, you said you would.
Yeah, I just
How
did.
about we just go with no?
Is there a reason we'd go with no other than laziness?
Well, I don't know why she wanted to ask,
No,
but
I just wanted to know, play my
Laziness
No,
is a good thing.
it's so true. Like, so I've been really bad about this. I'll try to get it posted by today, and yeah, but you will have one. Like, I've been really bad about getting them.
May or may
making
not
them
have
on time.
Yeah, I just feel like put it in my schedule, like I have to do this.
Yeah, no, you guys are definitely gonna have one.
You rock.
Did everyone get the sign-in thingy?
Oh,